I enjoyed almost everything about this book. I think the one thing that I didn't disliked is the title, which is Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite. It's an extremely misleading title because it leads one to believe that this is going to be a Jonathan Haidtian book about moral foundations or something of that kind. Not to say that I don't enjoy Haidt's work, but I've read so much of that kind of thing that I was not looking forward to it. And as it is, you only get onto the issue of hypocrisy at the very end of the book. And I actually think it's the least interesting part of the book.
Do you start all your interviews with identifying the things you did like? Because I don't know how many people come back. That's totally fair. That is 100% fair. So I guess what I would say a couple of things is, first of all, the title is very clever. And so I traded off a little bit because I just thought, it was so clever. I had to get it up there. That's one thing. The other thing I would say, not that you asked, but the other thing I would say is that the idea was to build up an argument starting from sort of scratch and then getting to a particular endpoint. And so I do see, whether it's good or not, the explanation of hypocrisy as sort of being the destination that you get to with the approach, the modular approach. So that sort of, that's not a reason, that's more of an excuse, I would say. Yeah. But
yeah, you do get there in the end. And it's not that the end is boring or let down or something, but it's just that the route to getting there is much more interesting than the actual destination and much more surprising, I think. So let's start by talking about modularity more generally. So perhaps one place we can start is you went to this old Disney World attraction called Cranium Control that shows a little boy, Buzzy, who's sitting there in the middle of inside a skull, and the different parts of his brain are doing different things, but he's ultimately in control of them all. Tell me about how persistent that idea is of the little person inside your head, behind your eyes, who's actually in charge, and how different your view of the brain is from that.
Yeah. First, I just want to say for viewers, unfortunately, Cranium Command is no longer with us. So it was an attraction at Walt Disney World. Yeah. So unfortunately, they lost their sponsor, that pavilion did. So a great loss. But on the other hand, a great victory that I had the chance to enjoy it and work at it. I didn't just enjoy their show. I was an operator on there. So to your question, in many ways, Buzzy in Cranium Command is sort of more or less just like the Cartesian dualism guy. So he's the soul, and then everything else is sort of the meat or something like that. And I think that's still super prevalent in a couple of super important places. One of them is in the field of psychology, where people are constantly talking about the self in a way that really, to me, smacks of this kind of like person in your head sort of thing. Like the self needs, reinforcement or something like that. So I think in that context, you see it very, it's pretty prevalent. And then also, I think just normal lay intuitions. I sort of, when people introspect about what's going on in their head, they feel like there's somebody in charge and it's me, whoever that is. And it feels like it's there's the hypothalamus in there. And then there's some part that does the vision. That's not me. I'm this guy who's in charge. I hear all the stuff. I'm going through what I'm going to say, and that's me. So I think, there's this really strong intuition. That's one place it persists. The other one is, I think in lots of academic psychology it does as well, less so now than in the past, but it's still in there somewhere. It's hard to get away from.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about modularity. At the beginning of the book, you give some examples, some quite famous examples that everybody knows, in which we discover some odd things about the brain. For example, you talk about blind sight, split brains, phantom limbs, optical illusions. All of these things imply a separation between, and in fact a contradiction between, what different modules within the brain are doing, and they lead to some odd contradictions. And your larger argument is that this is true of normal brains too.
Yeah.
Do you want to, most people probably know this example of the split brain patients, but do you want to talk us through that anyway and say how that applies to normal brains?
Yeah, I would just say that in some ways I feel like, yeah, so in the split brain studies, you have these patients who have the two hemispheres of their brain artificially separated. And this was a treatment, I think it was for epilepsy. And under those circumstances, the experimenter has this weird ability to sort of just talk to or communicate with one hemisphere of the brain, but not the other. So the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. So the experimenter says, point to something with your left hand, and that's the right brain is answering that question, and then the left brain, if you ask it why it pointed that way, remember the left brain is now insulated. It doesn't know why the right brain did what it did. So, but it controls the language. So it has to just make something up. And so I just felt like pointing to that thing. In the particular example I showed, it was a case where there's a pitchfork and a chicken, and so the person explains, well, they were cleaning up after the chicken. But the real reason they were pointing to the pitchfork is because the experimenter told their left brain to use the right hand to point to the picture of the pitchfork. So what that illustrates is, there are a few things I think are super interesting about that. One of the things that people don't talk about enough is, why don't the patients say, I don't know, I'm a split brain patient. You made my other, like, people always make up a story. And I think that's important because normal people do that too, right? How many times have you gone into the kitchen and you couldn't remember why, and someone asked you why you went in the kitchen? You just make something up. You don't, it's sort of weird to say, I don't know, there must have been some reason. People do this all the time, and for explaining their own behavior and explaining other people's behavior. And that's pretty important, it seems to me. And the lesson there is, a lot of your behavior might be driven by a part of your brain that you can't know about, that you don't know, you can't, talk to or talk about. And that means that we should be suspicious of our own motives. So, we're always going to tell the story that paints us in the best possible light, because reputation is important for social creatures like us. But not only are we going to be doing that strategically, but we often might not be able to answer the question why we did X, Y, or Z. And that's, I think, an important lesson of modularity, is that if you don't have access to all the motives and all the explanations for your behavior, you should be careful when you're explaining why you did what you did.
Yeah, you talk about encapsulation, which is the idea that different parts of the brain are designed to do different things. And those parts of the brain are often walled off from each other, i.e., you only have conscious access to certain processes. And that doesn't mean to say that those processes are the most important. They're simply the ones that you are consciously aware of and therefore able to, and perhaps also able to articulate. But there isn't necessarily a connection between the different modules. They're only interconnected where they need to be. So this is the idea of encapsulation. Could you give a couple of examples of that?
Sure. I think the optical illusions are one of the best examples of this. So people are familiar with these cases where you see two circles, and to all appearances, one looks larger than the other, and you could prove it to the viewer by manipulating environment a little bit. And you look at the thing, and it's clear as day that the two circles, whatever, they seem the same, or in some cases they look different. But you're completely persuaded that what you're seeing is not, in fact, an accurate portrayal of the world. So what that means is that your visual system has one sort of belief about the circles. And even though you know that the circles are whatever, that doesn't influence your perception. So you can't get that belief to shine back down into your vision. You can't make your eyes see them in the way that you know that they are. I find that very compelling. I think there's other examples like that as well. So other optical illusions, there are certain of them where once you see them, you can't unsee them. You can't go back to where you were. And there's a case where, again, your visual system is messing around with your processing. So I think optical illusions are the best case, because no matter how much and there's other examples where something looks big because it's in the distance, and something looks small because it's in the foreground. They still have that appearance to you. I also like the moon illusion. So when I was in undergraduate, this was one of the big illusions I did. The moon's on the horizon. It looks huge. You're like, oh my God. and then it's up in the sky, it looks tiny. You're like, that's the same thing? It looks completely different. And no matter how many times someone tells you why that's the case and that the two have to be the same size, moon hasn't changed. Knowing that doesn't help you. You can't sort of get around it. So I find those to be sort of the best examples for encapsulation, where the propositional knowledge and your beliefs just don't dig down into your visual system.
Yeah, you actually say that it's not only the case that there are systems that you're unaware of, there are actually systems whereby there are, as you put it, social payoffs to ignorance. So it's in some situations, it's actually beneficial for you to be not only not have access to the truth of a situation, but to have a false understanding. So it's sometimes actually beneficial for your information to be, the information you're receiving to be actually false.
Yeah. Yeah, I like those examples too.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I particularly, it's funny, I live here in Philadelphia, as you know, and I was just walking home and I had another one of these cases where in Philadelphia, there's this funny thing where if you're crossing a street and you look towards the oncoming cars, they are pretty likely to just barrel through the intersection because the driver knows that you've seen them, and so you can sort of get out of the way. But if you don't look, if you stay ignorant of the oncoming traffic and you just sort of look at your phone, walk forward, then they slow down because the driver thinks that you don't know that they're there. So their best strategy, they don't want to hit you. They will slow down in that case. So there's a really obvious case where ignorance is your friend. I think there's lots of social situations, the same thing. I just want to call out Robert Trivers. So Bob Trivers developed an idea about self-deception that matches pretty closely to this view. Folly of Fools was his book, which I recommend to your viewers. The same sort of idea, right? So if there's 3 different reasons why you might do something, and one of them is a pretty selfish reason, if you yourself are not aware of that selfish reason, then it's pretty easy to hide it, right? So the problem is once you have something in consciousness, other people might be able to detect that you're lying or dissembling or what have you. So, there's, I think, and I mean, I did some work with Jason Whedon, a really talented psychologist who was also a lawyer, where he was looking at people's strategies in the context of important issues like abortion. And in those contexts, it's pretty clear that people don't really know why they have the views that they do. And you can show that they don't really have those views by identifying contradictions and so on. And the reason that they don't know consciously what why they have their view is because they don't sort of want to get caught out, right? It's not persuasive to say to someone, I want the rule to be X because that is good for me, right? You want to say, I want the rule to be X because, there's this wonderful social benefit of that rule, or that's what God said, or that's whatever. And so there's a case where you really sort of want to hide it because it's easier to avoid being caught out in a selfish motive if you yourself aren't even aware of what's really going on.
Yeah. Also, as you say, knowledge sometimes entails duties. So, for example, if you are watching a burning house and a young boy points at a window and he says, "My cat is in there. Please go and save him." That boy has done you no favors, I think you say in the book, because while you didn't know the cat was there was no social penalty to you to just stand there and watch the house burn. But now that you've been told that the beloved cat is in there, there's an expectation that you will go in and save the cat, which is obviously very risky. But if you don't do that, then you'll suffer some social opprobrium. So other people's observations of what you know impact you. So it's often better not to have information. Famously, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I love those sorts of examples. I mean, this is why, of course, people will cross the street if they think there's going to be someone who is asking them for money, particularly for a good cause, for the same reason, because in some contexts, you might then have a duty or be perceived to have a duty to do something you'd rather not do. So yeah, I think there's a bunch of cases where strategic ignorance is, which was the way I phrased, other people have too. It sort of has lots of advantages. And so I mean, there are weird cases though, like people who don't find out the results of their medical tests. I still find this puzzling. I mean, I think you can tell the story to sort of start to explain that, but it becomes harder and harder to the extent that that information you're going out of your way to avoid could guide good decision making. I think that's like a sort of a tricky one. I'd be interested in viewers, people who are interested in, who have some insight into that, because I think that's a puzzle.
What you say in the book, which I found really interesting, is that having a very accurate knowledge of the truth of what is out there in the world is generally better if you are dealing simply with the physical environment, with plants and animals and laws of physics, etc., and no other people involved. There's no social element to it. Within reason, of course, you don't necessarily need to know everything about everything. But for example, if you are to go back to your example of crossing the road, if those were driverless Waymo cars on the road, then it would be much better to look and to see the cars coming, because the cars are not going to be impacted by whether they think you know or not. The cars themselves don't have any theory of mind. So if you are just dealing with a physical environment, the best thing is to have a very accurate sense of what is happening and what your own capabilities are, what your own possibilities are. The best thing is to be realistic. But once you add humans to the mix, that completely changes things. And it's exactly the same when you're crossing the street in India. Indians just walk straight out into the street and expect cars, and it's mostly mopeds in India, but expect mopeds to go round them. And if you are looking and waiting, you will never be able to cross.
Yeah.
You have to just step straight out. Actually, my strategy was to use Indian locals as human shields and just walk behind them. But the strategy is to not look where you're going, just step straight out and walk. And expect other people to adapt to you. Don't let them see that you see them. And there are social payoffs to being seen to not know something. So, for example, a friend of mine he is an Anglican priest, and back in the days when priests were not permitted to be gay, which went on for a while, so the church accepted gay homosexuality among the laity, but for a long time priests were expected to be straight. And his bishop once said to him, "Paul, I would like to make you aware of the fact that I am unaware of the fact that you are gay."
That's great. Yeah, that's a great example. And I think you put it just right. So individual decision, I'm not quite sure. I had difficulty with this concept, getting it across, or at least persuading colleagues back in the day. It seems to me very straightforward. I love the Waymo example. In the book, I use the Frogger example because I'm a Gen Xer, and so I grew up on video games, including Frogger. And Frogger, like as in the Waymo case, I think the Waymo case is actually a little better because it fits more closely what's happening when you cross the street. But in the Frogger case, you definitely want to look at the cars that are coming by. Like there's no strategy. So, there's no strategic element there at all in the context of a game, like a strategic game to two people. And as you say, a Waymo or, a robo-taxi or whatever is going to be same thing, right? Unless they're programmed in some strange ways. But once you get people involved there, and the strategic context is when, as you're saying, where it matters what I know about what you know, and you know that I know. Steve Baker, by the way, has a great new book on that kind of thing, shared knowledge.
Oh yeah, I know. I was just thinking about that. Yeah. It's next on my reading list.
Excellent. Yeah. It changes things, right? Because, and this is, I also just want to make a shout out. So Robert Frank was one of the first, people to explore this in the context of strategic interactions. He thought a lot about it in the context of taking away your own options for action, right? So his example was, you're playing chicken, and if you could throw your steering wheel out the window, then the other person knows that you can't swerve, and so you have the advantage. He's going to have to. But if this guy closes his eyes before you throw the steering wheel out, well, now throwing the steering wheel out doesn't help you. I think that's the same sort of insight, right? Like if I can close my eyes, I can take away your possibility, that strategic option that you have. And yeah, the logic of this seems pretty transparent to me. Again, I've had some difficulty persuading people, but by and large, yeah, once you're in a world where it's Waymos and Froggers, then you should just try to figure out, you should just be optimal. And then with strategic interactions, things become complicated, as the example of your priest sort of illustrates. I mean, that's what Don't Ask, Don't Tell was, right? So Don't Ask, Don't Tell here in this country was just a claim about strategic ignorance. No, we're going to we don't want to have the duty to do something with respect to this piece of information. I mean, in that sense, it's a relatively well understood sort of dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that, it's about whether what you're pitting yourself against is the real world out there or other people and other people's brains, perceptions in other people's brains. So, for example, if I'm baking a cake, the feedback is the physical universe. So it doesn't matter how confident I feel about the cake if I don't put in the right proportions of things, the cake is not going to turn out well, because the universe doesn't care how confident I feel about my ability to bake the cake. However, if I'm then presenting the cake to other people, how I present it to them may well make a difference to how it tastes to them.
Right.
It may well make some difference, and it may well influence them. And in fact, even my confidence in my abilities to make a good cake may have some influence on them.
Right.
If they know that I'm the kind of person who bakes good cakes, their taste experience can be affected, or their way of how they are evaluating that experience can be affected.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I was just going to say,
ahead.
I think this issue is, I don't want to take us too far afield, but I honestly think, so one question that I puzzled over, as a former academic, is why are the social sciences, in my opinion, the social sciences are pretty bad. And I think the right comparison is something like, to take your cake example, when Musk builds a rocket, it either gets into orbit or it doesn't. So again, the world is the feedback. And so in engineering, there's been all of this process, a kind of a natural selection process, an evolutionary process that select out people who can't make good rockets, that don't work. That doesn't happen in the social sciences. If you have a terrible theory of human social behavior, just an awful one, from the micro to the macro, as long as you do the right marketing, the world is not going to punish you. You don't suffer any losses for having an explanation which is woefully inaccurate or obviously dumb. I guess I can be a little bit salty here. And I strongly suspect this is one of the reasons that the social sciences have been so much slower than some of the other areas. So not to say there aren't failures in other areas. It says, you have a terrible theory about how people should organize themselves economically, politically, socially, and so on. And, as long as you sell it to the journals and so on, nothing blows up. But if you have a bad rocket, if you got a bad theory of how a valve works or how thrust works or how yaw works, then, the world's going to explode on you. So there's no selection process like the world. And to take your cake example. And I think at this moment, particularly in the US, when I think finally people are trying to look at the question of how should we organize our academic institutions? How can we organize them in such a way? I don't want to say people should pay for their bad theories, their incorrect ones, but at least move the incentive systems a little bit towards the rocket case as opposed to the pushing against air case, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You talk about there are a couple of sort of, talking of bad theories, a couple of shibboleths in psychology that you dismantle in the book in a very satisfying way. The first one being a particular bugbear, hated bugbear of mine, which is self-esteem, the concept of self-esteem. So I think everyone is familiar with this idea of cognitive dissonance, which is, people use that somewhat misleading term to describe people who are more confident about their own abilities than is warranted. This is also the kind of Dunning-Kruger paradox, the mount stupidity in Dunning-Kruger. And I think there are good reasons for overvaluing your own abilities, but one explanation that's always given is that this comes about because it makes you feel better. So the purpose of this kind of overvaluing of yourself, the purpose of the fact that you have, in a sense, false information in your evaluation of say, a specific skill of yours, that is the kind of underlying purpose of that, the deeper meaning of that is that it helps you feel good. It improves your self-esteem. And as you say, evolution doesn't care whether you're happy or not. Could you talk about that
Yeah.
a bit?
Yeah, it's funny. Even as you're talking about it, again, every time I hear this self-esteem remark, my eyes want to roll back in my head. So yeah, sorry if that's a bit spicy, but yeah. So I mean, I went to
I hate
well,
it.
yeah, I went to grad school in California, and so the self-esteem movement in the '90s, it was all over the place, right? So we just want to make kids or whoever it is feel good about themselves, and then everything great will happen. And the right way to think about self-esteem, in my opinion, Mark Leary and Roy Baumeister developed this idea, and then later on Lee Kirkpatrick and Bruce Ellis expand on it, is sort of like it's keeping track of how well you're doing, right? So they think of it as like a gas gauge, right? So the point of putting gasoline in your car isn't to make the gas gauge go up, and you can't make your car go further by physically moving the gauge outward, which is what the self-esteem work was doing. And yeah, exactly. So, and I think this is another good example where the Frogger case versus the strategic case is really valuable. So if I'm playing Frogger, or if I'm going to whatever try to cross the road, I don't want to overestimate my ability to get across the road, because that's a good way to get squashed, right? You want to have the true belief about how dexterous you are. On the other hand, if you and I are having a conversation and I say, I'm the world's best driver or street crosser, as long as that doesn't get challenged, that might help me, right? So that raises, this guy's a good street crosser. Huh, I want to be his friend. So there's a case where like the false belief as propaganda has value, but the false belief as a decision-making engine is not very useful. And so to the point about self-esteem is like, yeah, you don't want to raise people's self-esteem. That's just like artificially moving the gauge. What you want to do is you want to have people do the sorts of things that they're going to feel good about. Those are usually accomplishing adaptive problems, having good relationships, making friends, being successful in their work, whatever it is. But this idea that, that the whole goal should be to raise self-esteem. I mean, and the same scholars, like some people have subsequently shown that, there's many people used to think that bullying was that it was low self-esteem. And then there's this result, I think Lee Dessem has some work on this, that shows it's the reverse. It turns out that if you overinflate people's sense of self, that they kind of bully people, whether physically or emotionally or in relationships. And so, and you could imagine as an evolutionary matter why that might be, right? If I think I'm the top of the pack, we know what people at the top of the pack do. They use their topness to get what they want, coercively, one way or another. So yes, you're completely right that that's one of these bugbears. And I was so influenced by this chapter I read. It was an introduction to a book about self-esteem, and the editors of the volume say all of these chapters don't show that boosting self-esteem has these positive results that we expected. And they go on to say, well, we just need to find a way to show what this obviously true relationship is. It's like, it's just unbelievable that there's this lack of interest in looking carefully at the evidence, because their intuitions about the work that self-esteem's doing, it's just clear to them. So yes, that's why I got frustrated with that.
Yeah, I think the reason why, as you describe it in the book, people are often, or many people are prone to overestimate their own skill in a certain area, or for example, their own looks. So you give this example of people who are shown altered photos of themselves where they have been enhanced to look more beautiful, subtly enhanced, and they were asked to say which was the correct photo of them, and it had a realistic one and a subtly enhanced one, and they chose the subtly enhanced one, so they actually thought that they were better looking than they were. That is the kind of evolutionary basis for that is social. It's that if you are not convinced yourself, you're likely to be less persuasive to other people, but within reason. So you want to give people the best account of yourself that is plausible to them. So obviously, if you're too arrogant and too overblown, then it's no longer plausible. So you have to hit a kind of happy medium, and that seems to be at a very slight point of overestimation.
Yeah.
That you might be able to persuade people that you're a slightly better dancer or cook or whatever than you are.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, but the point of this module in the brain, like all the brain modules, is to have an impact on your evolutionary fitness, your ability to survive and reproduce and have surviving offspring. Part of what helps with your success in that is we're social animals, being accepted into the group, having friends and allies and mates, etc. But it's not about, there's no kind of like evolutionary drive towards just feeling better. And in fact, just feeling good is a very potentially passive thing. If you just feel absolutely great, then maybe you just sit there in a drunken stupor doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah. I mean, just look at your basic, you look at your basic old time opium den. Those people feel great, but they're not accomplishing anything useful, right? So evolution has sculpted our brains to reward the stuff that's getting us towards the ultimate fitness goals. And in many ways, that's a bummer, right? We're on this hedonic treadmill. So you and I live in these lives that couldn't be imagined as little as 100 years ago, with all the food we want, more or less, all the water we want, clean water, more or less, incredible healthcare. And yet, what are we doing? We're talking about, what's missing in my life? What's that, next book going to be, it's not like we're not, sitting around on the beach, just dancing, whatever, because evolution would penalize that design, right? That the guy's like, no, pretty good. It could be as the next guy, he's going to try to do a little better. And so we're on this hedonic treadmill. It's very irritating.
And we're competing with other people. So we have to stay alert. We can't be just smug and self-satisfied. We've got to be driven by something, and people are driven by want, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, why do you bother putting in effort?
Yeah. And it's brutal, because as soon as you get that next thing, right, you're in this position where, again, the hedonic treadmill, where I sort of adapt to that, and now I want the next thing. And yes, this is a way in which I do think there's some deep wisdom there. This is one area where I think that to some extent our friends who talk about Buddhism and whatever, or whatever that lyric is, it's not having what you want, it's wanting what you've got. There's some deep wisdom there to know, this is just evolution telling me I don't have enough. Maybe I should take a moment and think a little bit about that and ask myself, do I need that next thing? So that, I think, is, and I think Robert Wright has written quite a lot about this in a very elegant way about, how taking account of what evolution is trying to get you to do is helpful, and maybe might be useful to try to get some of that extra wisdom. Like, this is just a puppet master. This is just Darwin dangling my strings. It's hard. I mean, that thing's hard, right? That's why meditation is hard. That's why, Buddhism, all these things are hard, because millions of years of evolution pushed you to try to get just ahead of the next guy. And that is the burden we bear.
Yeah. I am particularly grumpy at the moment, so I'm not usually this grumpy. You have met me at a very grumpy point.
You don't seem grumpy, except for the opening where you said the one thing I don't like, but no, yeah.
No, I'm not saying I don't like it. It's just I feel like it sells the book a bit short.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll take that. Short.
Yeah. Well, Samuel Johnson says the flights of the human mind are not from pleasure to pleasure, but from hope to hope. That you talk about the function of emotions, and I love this part of the book as well, which is emotions are motivators. So the point of an emotion like fear is probably because that is either the expression of or the kind of prompt for a set of modules to move into action.
Yeah.
You see the snake. Your example is a bear, but we don't have any bears here. So You see the desert taipan, and you're no longer motivated by, do I fancy that good-looking guy over there, or do I feel like having a snack, or whatever. All those systems are overridden by a stronger set of modules, which are basically getting you to run. And you need to have a feeling associated with that. But there's a use for a transient feeling of reward, because that encourages you to do the things that are giving you that good feeling. And those are usually things evolution wants you to do. But there's no evolutionary rewards to contentment.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, this is also related to the project that I'm working on right now, which is all about emotions, because I think, and I should say, I'm Randy Nesse, who's, very well known evolution.
Good reasons for bad feelings.
Yeah, it's a great book. So he doesn't quite agree with the approach, which makes me think maybe I don't have it right, but well worth reading. So my view on this is, that every feeling that people can feel, they all are these feelings are measuring something out in the world, whether there's a bear or a kangaroo or whatever. So I guess kangaroos aren't that dangerous, but maybe they are. I don't know.
They're not dangerous at all.
Is that right? Okay, and sometimes you see them boxing. I don't know, but so you have these systems in your head, models in your head, and they're basically measuring. Is there a threat? Is there a potential partner? Am I hungry? And then they motivate an appropriate adaptive response. And as you say, somehow that symphony of all these different modules saying, I want your attention. No, I want your attention. Whoever the you is, that's Buzzy there, I guess. And, so I view each emotional system as sort of measuring something either inside the body or outside the body, and then motivating an adaptive response. And they all compete for having control of the muscles. So yeah, as you say, if there's a snake, or I think you have those blue ringed octopus there.
Oh yes.
Deadly, right? So so that's motivating you to swim away. Or again, if you haven't eaten in 3 days and you see a berry, that's motivating you to approach that. And as you say, the reward system is there because if you did something right, you won the football game, or they get all the pleasure from that. You should do that again. You should work to do whatever that is again. That's the reward system trying to motivate you to repeat the behavior to drive you closer and closer to good fitness outcomes. I think that's a powerful way to think about it. I will plug a little bit. So I'm working on this project called All the Feels, which is designed to catalog every single feel that humans can have, divided into sort of a kingdom structure, kingdom, phylum, class structure, sort of like the Linnaean system. And one thing that I will say about that, to your point about, you're not paying attention to this when that's happening, is that, it starts to raise these issues of consciousness, which is, we're conscious of all these different things, and yet we can't do all these different things at once. And so you need some way to arbitrate among those different options that you have. And I look forward to someone else figuring out. I mean, there's some people who had some of that stuff, like Damasio and so on. It's complicated, right? So our consciousness is somehow all these competing emotions, all these competing feelings to try to get us to do the adaptive thing, but they have to be prioritized, and that's the tricky part.
Yeah, so you talk about, you talk about this in relation to willpower. So this another idea from psychology that I absolutely hate, which is the idea of ego depletion, that you have a certain amount of willpower, and over time that willpower gets used up. So for example, if you don't eat the chocolate chip cookie, you're going to find it much harder to do the maths puzzle. And that's because you've used up too much of your willpower on resisting the cookie. And your modular explanation of what's going on is much more interesting, I think. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? The willpower illusion.
Yeah, this is right up there with self-esteem as one of my little bugbears. So I do want to preface this by saying, when I wrote that, the word, this theory was everywhere, and it was well established and well accepted. Over the last decade, I think finally the nail has been put in this coffin. Although there's still sort of a Dunkirkian holding action a little bit by a few people, but more or less, I think this idea has pretty much been relegated to the dustbin of history. I recommend people take a look at their Substackers, to take a look at Mickey Inslicht. He's got a Substack where he talks about, because he was one of these guys and converted. But so here's the way I think about this kind of stuff is that, one of the things that happens when you're working on, let's say, tough math problems, or you're doing a very repetitive task, is there's a sense that it feels hard, and it often feels harder over time. And I think what's going on there is that, as we were just saying, the problem is you can't do multiple things at once. You only got two hands, one pair of eyes, you only look at one thing. And so evolution needs a way to sort of say, is it really worth continuing on this task? I mean, the way I always think about it, I'm going to go back to bears, is, if you're a bear and you're eating berries, the rate at which you're getting berries goes down over time because you've got all the easy ones, yada, yada, yada. At some point, it's got to be better to go to the next bush. And if I were a bear, I feel like that's what it would feel like. It would feel like, I should probably stop this. I'm not enjoying this berry experience anymore. I like individual berries, but I'm not getting enough berries per time. I think I'm going to, and my guess is that's what the sense of effort in humans is. It's basically saying, unless there's some good overriding reason that you are going to, you need to do this task, you should probably stop. And I think this is the same sense you get when you're, like, for example, working out. You're running along and you've got a few miles and like, right back. And that's evolution saying, look, if you don't have to keep running, don't, because, the risk of catastrophic damage keeps going up as you're running more, right? So lactic acid is building up, the temperature is getting higher, the probability that something really bad is going to happen. Now, if you're being chased by a bear, you still should run. But what that sense is telling you is you need to think about whether this is the right way to spend your time. And so that's what I think explains the sense of effort that we have, is it's a stop signal that says, okay, close this file unless there's some overriding reason not to. And I think one of the reasons I find that interesting is because of its opposites, like curiosity. Curiosity is sort of saying, you should probably keep looking into this. Like, curiosity is basically measuring, is there more information that I can get with a reasonable amount of time and cost? And frustration is kind of like effort, but on steroids. Frustration is like, I am getting nowhere. I'm putting in a lot of effort and I am getting nowhere. Close this file, maybe come back to it later. But I sort of like that interpretation because it rationalizes at least my internal experience of the way these things work. So yeah, maybe all of the stuff is all about me, but that is how I experience it.
Yeah. So you say that modularity can explain, going back to willpower a little bit, modularity can explain why people lock their refrigerators at night. One of the two great mysteries of life, according to one of the writers that you're citing, is why people lock their refrigerators. I actually don't know anybody who locks their refrigerator, but
right. I think
but it's a metaphor, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that the economists really did know people who lock their refrigerators, but I think it is a metaphor, right? So you can say the same thing with people who, for example, they have things on their computer that prevent them from checking their social media every, for half an hour or something like that. And the reason I like that is, it's sort of this weird, so if you're an economist, which, that was where the quote came from, it's like, no, you're just rational. So if it's not rational for you to eat the food at 1 a.m., at 10 p.m., you don't have to plan that because it's still not right. Your trade-offs are the same. But if you think that your mind has some sort of short-term modules and some long-term modules in there, and the short-term modules have more control, as you were saying, like you've got all these conscious experiences and it's 1 a.m. and you're really hungry, then even though there's one module that says, I really like to be trim, and then there's this other module like, I'm really hungry. And you could imagine that at 10 p.m., I'm really hungry, this guy isn't really screaming that loud. He doesn't have control over the behavior. This one has. The long-term module does. And then and this is the crucial thing, as the internal and external environment varies, which modules exert more influence also changes. To your point about, you don't want to chat up the person when there's a kangaroo, or I guess it's like a snake attacking you.
A snake, yeah. Kangaroos are,
Yeah.
they're quite dangerous if you're a rival male kangaroo.
I've never been. So
and the females are on heat.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I don't
if
know.
that's not the case, you're probably fine.
Yeah. I've never been a male kangaroo, so I think good. So, but yeah, the point is, the modular view sort of points your attention to this idea that changes inside and outside are going to make one modular system more or less in control depending on those parameters. So it's not like there's one Buzzy and he's just always sitting there and like, I wonder if I should have snacks at night. No, I definitely shouldn't. So whether it's day or night, I'm not going to. No, it's like, well, if the little guy, I think it's played by that guy who played Norm in Cheers, is the stomach, and he's like, man, you got to get me something here. And he's running the show at 1 a.m. He's like, okay, no, this is what we're doing right now. That I think the modular view sort of helps to explain this dynamic aspect of human psychology. We're not just one optimizer. It depends on the environment, both internal and external. And I find that a very useful way to think about stuff. Again, probably the way my own behavior, right? So I know I'm not going to, snack. So I know a little bit about my model. So for example, I can avoid buying snack food in the grocery store every time. But man, if someone brings over chips, I mean, I'm defenseless. I just know that the cost, I can't avoid them. So, which is, again, like, and if you're an economist, that's irrational. If you don't want the chips, then you shouldn't have them. And like, well, tell my brain that, or at least that module.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a kind of suggestion usually in these willpower models that there's a good self and a bad self. There's the angel and the devil.
Yeah.
But of course, your short-term modules are also useful. At some point, you need to eat. And the longer it has been, the stronger that urge is going to be. And that is adaptive, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. These systems, I mean, it's funny because as you know, I was just down in Australia. There was this spider that we came across that, we were with a tour guide and he had to point it out with it's like practically invisible. And every time you see evolution in action, you're like, my God, how did that happen? It's just excruciatingly well designed. And then you think, what's the hunger system now look like? It's pretty well designed, right? Like it's not a coincidence that we get access to sweet things that have nutrients that you need, like salts and fats and so on. Your hunger system's like, you should keep doing that because, in the environment in which we evolved, that would have been a very good design. Exploit the resources that you have now. And so, and then the satiety system is incredibly complicated as well. So you don't want to, you should expect these systems to be very good at their jobs. They do funny things in the modern world, right? The problem with modules in the modern world is that there's all of these companies out there that want to give my modules exactly what they want, right? So sugary, fatty snacks that I can't get enough of. I think the attention economy is the best example of this, right? Where all of the companies now, they just want to figure out how to get me clicking back in. And I have a brain that's very interested in things like, oh, I wonder what's happening to that person. That's an important person. I wonder what they did, right? Oh, someone was just on the Jumbotron. I would like to know about that relationship of important people. And we're helpless. And I think, as you mentioned, John Haidt at the top of this discussion, he's been, I think, very, very adept at pointing out what happens to an evolved brain in a world of companies that grow when they figure out how to grab your attention. I find that that's one of the most scary things out there. And then if you imagine that AI is going to make that even better, God help us.
So I want to talk a little bit about ignorance versus knowledge and the different the modularity of that. So there was a psych experiment that I was actually involved in that I've always found quite fascinating so I'll say to preface this that I'm not a person who has gaydar. So I consider myself a person, I know if a man is gay, if he tells me he's gay, I'm introduced to his boyfriend, or he is camp and kind of doing the gay voice and gestures and being effeminate, etc. And even then I have some false positives. So I don't consider myself someone with any kind of sixth sense about men's sexuality. And the task that I was involved in, we were shown a group of photos of faces, and I think all the men were clean shaven. So and you couldn't see anything that they were wearing. It was just the face from the neck up, just close-ups of headshots. And you had to say whether they were gay or straight. And I remember telling the experimenter, I really don't know. I'm just going to be guessing at random. This is pointless. And he said, just guess, And I had a very high hit rate. And I went out back into the world, and most people had a better than chance hit rate. I don't know if this experiment has replicated, but I went back out into the world at large, and I still don't feel that I can tell whether a man is gay or not, certainly not by just looking at his face.
Mm-hmm.
So it's as though there are some areas in which there is knowledge that you have, but is not at the level of conscious awareness, and you're not even able to access it because your conscious awareness kind of gets in the way.
Yeah.
And it was actually a struggle to make myself guess. My strong conscious feeling was, really don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, oh, I'm just guessing whatever. I'm just taking whatever completely at random. And that was a very effective way of being able to tell. So that's like a system that a module that seems to be shut off from conscious awareness. But there's also the kind of opposite, which is some modules you say, and this is one of your most counterintuitive arguments in the book, work better when the information that they have is actually false, when they actually have false beliefs about the world. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I just want to just backtrack for 1 second, because you mentioned again at the top of this discussion about blind sight, and those examples are super interesting, right? So there you have cases where the person can't report, any visual experience whatsoever, and yet they're above chance in some, visual task, and they definitely can't tell you how they're doing it. I mean, it's a little bit, I think of this a little bit like, when you hear a sentence in your native tongue and it's wrong, you often can't exactly say what's wrong about it, right? You don't have the grammatical rule available to consciousness. It's wrong. So I think those cases, like that sort of motivates the intuition. Now, in terms of, so the cases where you're better off having a false belief, I think the best examples of that are cases where you've got groups. I mean, in the most extreme cases, you've got groups where if you espouse the wrong belief, you're going to die, right? So like I just finished reading Infidel by Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Fantastic book. And there it really is a matter of life and death. So at whatever moment she's doubting whether or not, there's one God and it's Allah and he's, said this and that, and all these things in the book are true. And at any given moment in that particular time in that location, for her to genuinely endorse a belief that's, counter to that, and maybe a true belief, because so she becomes an atheist and then a Christian, or maybe it's the other way around. That would be dangerous for her. And I think this happens all the time. I mean, I don't know, my late John Tooby, who was my advisor back at UC Santa Barbara, my co-advisor at Lead Cosmoses. I mean, he talked a lot about this in the context of what was going on in science, which is even scarier, because there's all sorts of places in science where you sort of got to endorse just a daffy set of beliefs or you're going to be kicked out of the club. I mean, I think a lot about Lee Jessam's work on stereotype accuracy, where he's able to show all these cases where, and this to your point about the study you were in, there's all these ways in which, some stereotypes are accurate. And, there are lots of contexts in which if you agreed with Lee, if you believed his data, whatever that would mean, you wouldn't get conference invitations, you might not get promoted, you might be, excommunicated from your group. There's all sorts of, true beliefs, which in the right group context, if you voice them, you could die. So those are extreme cases, but there are all kinds of intermediate cases, right? So if you were trying to, develop a romantic relationship with someone, and they, there might be a whole vocabulary of true beliefs that if you said them out loud or you somehow, made it clear that you believe them, you endorse them, that would be that. It would be over. So
I have this issue all the time.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people do, particularly in the modern world. So there's a sad, there's a lot of this data coming out that suggests, particularly in this country, but elsewhere as well, that people are disqualifying mates in virtue of their political commitments. Now, we can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but what it is a thing. And what that means is, there's all sorts of beliefs, many of which are going to turn out to be true, that if you say them out loud or if you disclose, if you somehow drop whatever. And this is, again, the sort of the Bob Trivers argument. If you just believe the false thing, you can't accidentally sort of disclose that you've got the bad one.
Yeah, you'll be more convincing. So you can always lie,
you can lie.
but it's more, it's you risk being found out when you lie. Whereas if you're not lying, then you're safe.
Right. That's the true. Yeah. The truest view is, look, just get the false belief in there, and then you don't have to worry about, remembering what you said, because maybe whatever. I find that a compelling argument. That I think of that as sort of like a propaganda argument. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of cases where you want the propaganda to be, the false belief, not the true belief. Again, religion, I think, is the most obvious case, but I think we should be looking more at how this is interacting with science. I mean, I don't know. I used to go to humanities lectures when I was in the anthropology department at UCLA way back in the day. I guess those people genuinely believe the things that they were saying. I find it hard to imagine. I think Sowell has some quote about how only, there's some sets of beliefs which are so absurd that only an intellectual can believe them. I mean, spending some time in that area led me to believe that might be the case, but maybe they believe that stuff. I can tell you, had they endorsed counter beliefs to that, yeah, they very well might have cost them their jobs or their friends.
Yeah, and it does seem that people's beliefs are very flexible, that people do change their minds when their political tribe changes their minds about something. We see this all the time. And that's one of the things that we are actually getting onto the topic of hypocrisy. That's one of the things that people tend to think of as hypocritical. But I don't think it's exactly that people are lying about their views in order to stay in with the in crowd, but they genuinely have shifted over without realizing. So they've genuinely altered how they feel about free speech or taxation or whatever it might be, because they're influenced by the people in their political group, because we have a very strong natural urge to be accepted by the group, and that actually changes our beliefs, as opposed to we're just lying about our beliefs to stay in good standing.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Yeah, so I reserve the notion of, I try to reserve the notion of a really specific little category where a person condemns X and then does X, and I want to separate that from I think where you're kind of navigating to, which is, yeah, people change the, I don't know. I don't want to name names, but there's a grad student who I met when I was in California, and he's a grad student too, and socialist, and everyone should share everything. And then, 3 years later, it turns out he gets a faculty job at the Stern School in NYU, and all of a sudden he's libertarian. It's like, no, people should keep their stuff. People work hard for what they've got. Taxation is stuff. Like, okay. And that, again, which is fine. Like, I mean, but people are entitled to change their views. And, I believe that everybody more or less adopts political opinions to some extent, at least, that they're based on their self-interest, right? I mean, I've written some stuff on that with Jason Whedon, who I mentioned earlier. Self-interest drives your attitudes. And part of that interest is cohering with the other people around you, so yeah, I don't know who, if you had something particular in mind, but like, I found it very funny watching the view that people take of Elon Musk. He's a hero, and and then he's a villain, and then and then he gets into a fight with Trump, then he's a hero again, and now he's like, I don't. And the guy didn't change, and yet the people's attitudes towards him. Which, again, I want to be very clear: people are entitled to whatever attitude towards Elon Musk. I've never met the guy; I don't know the guy. They want, but it does sort of feels like the wind all of a sudden changes, and then I completely throw this kind of thing. I will plug one study I did with my former student Peter Scholey, where we put people in a little experimental game where one person was the typist and they had to write this thing, and the other person had to check the work. It was harder to be the typist. It was easy to be the checker. And before the experiment, before we assigned roles, we said, how much should people be paid? We're going to assign you randomly. Should you get even money, or should you be paid based on the effort? In which case the typist would get more. We get their response, and then we assign the roles. They do the task, and just literally 5 minutes later, we say, okay, how should you assign the rewards for this? In 5 minutes, people change their mind. It's not a huge effect. It's a psychology experiment, so it's not huge. But all of a sudden, they're like, if they're the typist, like, oh no, what's important is effort. People should be rewarded by effort. And the guys who are the checkers, like, oh, we were assigned randomly, so it should be like, that's in 5 minutes. So imagine you have a year with a community that has a different belief than the one you came in with, and yeah, we're malleable creatures in that sense. I mean, it is hard to stay principled as a social creature when other people around you are, expecting a certain set of beliefs and are going to punish you for the wrong ones.
Your explanation of hypocrisy, if I've understood it right, is there are some modules that are responsible for your own well-being, and there are other modules which are responsible for the kind of judgments that you make of other people. And it's a very, as you point out, it's a really unusual thing. Very few other animals are really preoccupied with what other animals are doing. That kangaroo is probably not judging the other kangaroo for scratching his balls too much or something. And it makes sense for most animals to be fixated primarily on their own behavior, and then perhaps the behavior of the small group that they're in, their allies, the behavior of opponents, of mates, of children, of offspring, but people who are directly connected. Whereas we seem to have this module that is interested in coming to strong judgments about people with whom we're not connected in any way, because those judgments shape the social environment that we ourselves are in, and it can shape it in a way that benefits us. Would you like to talk a bit
Yeah.
about that?
I mean, I think you put it just right. I would go even stronger and say that, I don't think any other species on this planet engages in moral judgment. I think it's just us. And the reason for that is that I think moral judgment is designed for side taking when conflicts arise among in groups and coalitions and alliances and so on. And no other creature does this. So if you look at, there are some that form little alliances, but almost all of them are kin-based. And so they don't need a way to choose whose side to be on. They're going to support their kin. And so in virtue of that fact, it seems like a strange claim, but my claim would be the humans are the only hypocritical species, and that's because we're the only ones capable of moral judgment. So I think of this as like the finger wagging system. You're bad. I'm going to side with the person who you're in the conflict with because you did the bad thing. And then, then you got these other systems which are just like, well, I'm going to do whatever's best for me. And occasionally doing the thing that I'm wagging my finger at you for doing, I'm going to do that. And that's that's the payoff of modularity, is like you've got one system that's getting your good outcomes and another system that's wagging its finger. And sometimes those things are going to be consistent. And I think in the modern world, there's just very few people who are, whatever. I just wrote a piece about Sam Harris. So Sam Harris, he hates Donald Trump with the fury of 1,000 burning suns, and yet Trump does something where Harris is like, nope, that was actually the right move. I respect that, and I'm not saying that's exactly.
I love Sam.
Yeah, he's great. Again, one of the more, it's sort of the last bastion of principle, and that's part of my point. And if you had to guess, is Sam going to do something that he has condemned? You'd say probably not. Like, that seems very off-brand for him. And yet most of us, and that's the parenthetical in the title, like each one of us likes to think we're not going to, but we are, because our moral system is not tightly coupled to our behavioral system, you get a disjunction there. And so, people are going to do the thing that they said that was bad when the other person did it. I don't see any way out of that. Like, that's just the nature of a modular mind. You're just, we could try to minimize it ourselves. And I think there's a lot to be said about that and yada, yada, yada. But I mean, I can't imagine that you could, once you have the moral judgment system, it's very difficult to get out of the possibility that the organism is going to do exactly what it condemns.
Yeah. Talking of Sam Harris, I find it very interesting, the stuff that you had to say about the Libet experiments and free will. So I feel that free will is one of those places where it's easiest to see the kind of contradiction between various modules. So there are some contradictions between brain modules that are accessible to the conscious mind. Not all of them are accessible, but this is one. Famously, when Christopher Hitchens was asked if he believed in free will, he said, "Of course I believe in it. What other choice do I have?"
Great line.
And it's a place where it's kind of the closest I have to a woo-woo belief is my non-belief in free will. And it's, on the one hand, I don't believe in free will, but on the other hand, I feel, act, and behave as if I have free will and other people have free will. And like Christopher Hitchens, I don't have any choice in that matter at all. It's as though those two pieces of knowledge are completely separate from each other. It's like an optical illusion.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this optical illusion in the book, which is, I looked at it and I immediately saw a Dalmatian. And then you say, it's actually just dots on a page, but no matter how much I look at it, I can't see dots.
Yeah, you
I can
can't
only see it.
Yeah.
I can't unsee the Dalmatian. And the same thing is going on here. There's one part of my brain, the same part that knows that it's just dots on the page, that feels there's no such thing as free will. And there's the other part of my brain which feels I have free will, which sees only the Dalmatian.
Yeah.
That there's no way these are random dots. That is a picture of a Dalmatian. That's that. And one of the things that pieces of evidence that Sam cites in his book about free will, one of the pieces of evidence he cites against free will, which you kind of disentangle here, is the Libet experiment. Can you talk a little bit about why the Libet experiment isn't a good proof of the non-existence of free will?
Yeah, I find it very odd that people find that result persuasive. So the basic bit is that you can ask people when they've taken a particular decision, and it's possible with neuroscience to show that that decision in the brain was made before that moment occurred.
So there's activity, and say you ask them to move you ask the person to lift their hand, and you ask them to tell you the exact moment at which they decided to lift the hand. And you can see that there was activity in the brain previous to them feeling that they had consciously decided to move the hand. That's the Libet experiment.
You put it much further than I did, so I appreciate that. Yes. And my reaction to that has always been like, how else could it have been? Like, I mean, I guess you could say it's somehow, let me put it this way. If you have a buzzy view of the mind, to go back to where we started, then I could
see his little man,
little
inside,
guy, his little guy in there.
Yeah.
Then you would say, oh, it should be the same time, because he's the decider. He's going to be like, okay, and so he's going to tell you when he decided, he's going to make a decision. But if you have a modular view where there's all this stuff that bubbles up, and then at some point, some of it is conscious, right? There's all this stuff going on in your visual system, like edge detectors and stuff like that, which you don't know about, you can't talk about. But, your system bubbles up, and then you have the visual world or whatever. My presumption is that that's the way everything works, is that you've got all these systems in place, and then at some point you become aware of the vision, the deciding, the whatever. So there's always going to be, not always, but some stuff's got to come first. And again, the only reason you would think it would be at the same time is if you've got this homuncular, buzzy man in the head side. So I don't find that stuff very persuasive. Now, maybe I'm just not thinking about it right again. So when I disagree with people whose intellect I respect, and I very much respect Sam's, I feel like, maybe I'm missing something here. And I'd be happy. I should also say, I haven't read this. I've read, a couple of his pieces, books, whatever, but I haven't read that. It just seems to me, my reaction when I read that finding was like, what did you expect? That the thing that is conscious would have consciousness right at the start of that decision-making process? Maybe, but I don't see why you would think that. So that's why I don't find those results particularly compelling. I do want to say that I would land where you are, which is something like, look, I'm a determinist. There's molecules and they bounce against each other. But like, I can't have a conversation with another human being and just view them as an automaton. And so, so I wind up in the same camp. Functionally, I just become there's free will. And then, I'm a Laplacian, like, oh, no, but of course, there's no quantum vibrations that is giving me free will, or whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
I know it feels that way. So, but that's where I wind up on that.
It's like the physicist joke where I can't remember which physicist this was, but someone asked him, have you met my wife? And he said, yes, I've met your wife. And he says, what did you think of her? And he says, she's made up of quarks and electrons like everyone else.
Yeah.
It's kind of the wrong level.
Don't get invited to a lot of parties, I hear. Yeah.
I think one of the things that in the book that you keep accentuating is that the part of you that is conscious is no more you, or is no more your mind than any other part. Some processes are conscious, others are not. Some are interconnected and others are walled off from each other. And also the part of you that is verbally articulate is no more you than any other part of the brain. These are all just modules, and you have a lovely image. Let me find this. Michelangelo is famously quoted as saying, "I saw the angel in the marble and carved until I set him free." Some economists, and psychologists as well, are in some sense like this. They start with theories in which agents, people, have some idealized rational mind, minus the stuff that economists carve away. Thus we see terms like biases, heuristics, and irrationality. They document departures from supposed perfection, rationality, much as a sculptor chips away marble, hoping that when they are done, human nature is left, like Michelangelo's angel. I see no reason at all to proceed this way, as though human psychology is perfection minus shortcomings. My view, the modular view, is more clay than marble, like sculptors who add bits of clay one after another until the product is done. Natural selection added and changed, different bits giving rise to the final product. We'll get done with psychology not by chiseling away at human shortcomings, but by building up a catalogue of human capacities working together or in opposition in various contexts.
I stand by that, and I do want to say, just to put it out there for readers, I did spend time with economists, so I feel comfortable talking about how they think, because I lived with them at Caltech for a couple of years, University of Alaska Anchorage for a while. So I am a little bit of an anthropologist in that world. So I don't want to speak as one, but I do want to speak as someone who's familiar with them. And I do kind of think that at least for a while, maybe less so now, but certainly, for a while, characterized to some extent at least. And Kierkegaard Gigerans, by the way, has written very nicely on this as well, where, he has this great quote where he talks about, he's having a discussion with an economist, and the economist says, "Oh, so you're saying everything is either rational or psychological?" And I think that, that also reflects this worldview. Don't get me wrong. I mean, humans are incredibly good at a whole bunch of stuff. And so, yeah, if you compare them to a rock, we're pretty rational in the sense that we make pretty good decisions, and, we pretty good at a lot of different things. But yeah, that is my view of the agenda. The agenda should be not chipping away, but adding on. And I do think to some extent that has been happening in psychology. I mean, even the heuristics and biases literature has sort of transmogrified a little bit into an ecological rationality literature, which is, I think, which comports much better with the kind of the evolutionary psychological sort of analysis. So, I stand by that, and my view is that, it's going to be a minute before we've got the whole catalog of human nature done. I think there's a lot of modular systems, and each module has submodules, and they share, and they're complicated. And I should say David Petraszewski has some nice work on this, where he lays out these ideas very, very nicely. And I should also say he doesn't even like the word module anymore. He and Annie, I think. But I think that as a way to set an agenda, it makes more sense to be additive and multiplicative and so on, as opposed to subtractive. Now, maybe that's going to turn out to be wrong, but that's certainly the perspective that I bring to trying to understand human nature.
Yeah, you say that it's better to have systems that are specialized. So it's better to be like a kind of iPhone with lots of different apps than to be just trying to do everything with the same brain, as it were. It's better to have lots of different functions that are specialized for their own function and that are going to be more or less dominant in different situations. I'm going to quote here from Marvin Minsky's book, Society of Mind, which you also quote from. So I'm quoting from it from your book.
Yeah.
Minsky writes, because I think it's a nice way of describing this: the mind is a community of agents. Each has limited powers and can communicate only with certain others. The powers of mind emerge from their interactions, for none of the agents by itself has sufficient intelligence. In our picture of the mind, we will imagine many sub-persons or internal agents interacting with one another. Solving the simplest problem, seeing a picture, or remembering the experience of seeing it, might involve a dozen or more, perhaps very many more of these agents playing different roles. Some of them bear useful knowledge, some of them bear strategies for dealing with other agents, some of them carry warnings or encouragements about how the work of others is proceeding, and some of them are concerned with discipline, prohibiting or censoring others from thinking forbidden thoughts.
Sometimes I think that guy was from the future. I mean, yeah, the reason I quote that is because
This is 1976.
exactly,
Yeah,
I
he
just,
wrote that.
it's hard to remember what things were like back then. But like, my dad was a computer programmer, and at the time, no one really knew what that meant. This is a guy writing in a way that would be perfectly recognizable in the modern moment in terms of the way people do code and
Mm.
so on, separation of concerns. He's writing that stuff in the mid 70s about psychology. Again, if someone told me, yeah, he's from the future and he came back in the 70s and he wrote that stuff, I'd be like, yeah, that tracks. Because yes, then the reason I quote it is because I don't feel like I could have put it better myself. That seems to be, to me, that seems to be about the way the mind works. Now, I don't want to discount whatever this consciousness thing is. That does seem sort of interesting and special, but I feel okay kind of saying, because no one really understands how that works anyway. So yes, there's something special about the sense of me that I have that people might say, well, Minsky's not really capturing that part of it. But I think because we have to be very cautious about under our understanding of consciousness and say, okay, well, you don't have an explanation for it either. So, no one knows
Uh-uh.
how you get, conscious stuff from physical stuff. And maybe it is from that. Like you have a whole bunch of these guys, these agents that were all these different jobs with limited knowledge. And so, yes, so I quote that because I really think back then he nailed it. And, I think set the tone for what was going to be coming in cognitive science. And to some extent, it really has.
Yeah, I think perhaps part of the problem in psychology, this is a slight tangent, is that is it a science or is it a kind of therapy? Because a lot of the therapeutic stuff seems at odds with scientific explanation. So we talked a little bit about, we didn't use this term, but negativity bias earlier on, that people are driven by dissatisfaction. And I often hear this kind of psych talk explanation that negativity bias is a really bad thing. Why do you, when you get 100 good compliments about your article, why do you focus in on the one negative comment? But negativity bias is extremely useful because the negative things are the things that you potentially need to do something about or need to flee from or avoid or whatever, that you actually need to modify. Whereas the kind of no notes, everything is wonderful thing, you don't need to do anything. So it's a motivator, but obviously there is an optimum amount, because if you're completely paranoid, that is a waste of your time and energy. And it's also liable to have social knock-on effects because other people won't like you, and that will also be bad for your evolutionary fitness. But it feels that the self-esteem, the idea of positivity, etc., all of this comes from a therapeutic branch of psychology that is kind of divorced from a scientific, a more kind of fact-based
Yeah.
view.
I have
Um,
yeah, it's a fair point. I have complicated feelings about this because there are, for sure, very talented clinical psychologists who are completely wedded to the scientific method, and they're first-rate scientists at Penn. I had colleagues in the clinical area who were among the best clinicians, best scientists I've come across. So, just to say, there is good science being done in clinical psychology.
mm,
Having
mm.
said that, if you subject yourself to 20 minutes or 5, even on the Psychology Today website,
Oh my
you're,
God.
where you're reading about how is my stress at work influencing my dog. I mean, yes, all bets are off. It's just the Wild West. More or less say whatever they want to say. So in that sense, I completely agree. It depends what playground you're in. Like if you're in the laboratory, back in those guys, then I think there's some really good work. But even then, you say, look, like what they're doing, psychology is hard. I remember again a conversation with John Tooby where, I was so excited about evolutionary psychology. I thought, this approach is so powerful by understanding the mind with these tools as an evolved, you know, software machine that solves adaptive problems. Or I said, well, we're gonna be done before my career is over. And he just laughed at that. It's 1,000 times more complicated than you think. We've sketched out 1% of the mind, if that. And not only that, but then as the replication crisis, which is basically this idea that many studies, when people try to replicate them, don't successfully, in fact, show the same results, is telling us that even if we had, our tools are faulty and we're trying to get at something which is incredibly complicated. All of that is to say, and then, clinical psychology is basically what happens when the machine doesn't work right. Well, if you don't know what the machine does when it works right, it's pretty hard to answer the question of what happens when it breaks. So I have a lot of sympathy and I spent a lot of time. So as you probably know, the Substack that I write on the living fossils with Josh. So Josh is a clinician, and so I've gotten a much better chance to see that profession on the ground. So he's a real clinician. He sees patients and so on. And he basically says the same thing. He's like, the best treatment for my patients comes when I develop a good relationship with them. I don't need to know what the DSM says. I don't need to know these things. They're changing it all the time anyway. I mean, and I also think a little bit about, when I was growing up as a kid, the idea that depression had to do with imbalances of serotonin or other neurotransmitters, you could take that to the bank, right? And I'm not saying it shouldn't correct itself. Of course it should. But sometimes it feels like, is there anything that's been sort of solid and you can take home and feels, on solid foundations? And I guess all of that is just to say, I agree with you. There are systemic issues in clinical psychology, but with the caveat that there's excellent work being done and there's some excellent scholarship for sure. And I think in, 20, 30, 50 years, we're going to have a very different perception of, what the therapeutic track looks like. How do we improve psychological well-being? Because I think my view and I'm not a clinician, my view is, we're struggling right now. And I think we're going to continue to struggle for a little while.
One thing that I was struck by as I was reading the book, so you talk a lot about the misleading nature of talking about the person, the self. So at one point you cite someone saying that it's a guy who is dying of cancer, but even though he tells his friends that he's going to recover, and he seems to think he's going to recover because, for example, he books a cruise that's scheduled for next year, but he still goes to get the treatment, and so in some ways he's behaving as though he will survive, in other ways he's behaving as though he will die. And you say, some people would say, well, what he really believes is that he's going to die, but that it doesn't make any sense to talk about he there or really. It's different parts of him believe different things. And I wonder whether how that idea that the self is an illusion, how that fits with the idea of personality. Because I think of the self as not being so much it's one unified thing in my own brain. It's more like the differences between me and other people.
Yeah, interesting.
How does personality fit into that? Or is that something
Yeah,
I mean, if you decide you don't want to go into this, I'll just cut it from there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I will say, yeah, personality I find very confusing. I do want to address a little bit. So I do think that there's something very interesting and true about the idea that in the case of our cancer patient, I do think it's important to say that there's no real reason to use this word really or genuinely or whatever, that once you have this modular view, again, if you're the Buzzy case, then you say, okay, no, what does Buzzy think? But if there's no buzz, you're like, well, one piece of me thinks he's going to survive. One piece of me thinks he's not, or has a representation, as you might say in cognitive science, and acts conditional on that representation. And my view on that is, okay, well, yeah. So his whole brain is in his skull, but one part believes this one. So there's no real problem there. In terms of personality, I don't really know much about personality. My sense is that, first of all, personality is very strange. It's complicated. And there's a part of me that wonders if we sort of get lost in the noise with personality. Like, human nature is pretty similar. So yeah, there's some variation. This guy's a little more neurotic and that was a little bit more agreeable. But the reason that we can see these things as large is because the vast panoply of human nature that we share is so big that once you see some dimension that differentiates it, you get right in close to it, like a magnifying glass or a microscope. You're like, oh, if you take a distance, you say, how is Rob different from that, chimpanzee and that orangutan? You could start to talk a lot about this and that. But then if you want to say, well, how is he different from my own? You'd be like, well, you need to get really deep in there. You gotta get, he's like a little more agreeable or a little more neurotic or whatever. He's a little less extroverted or more, whatever it is. But the only reason we pay attention to these dimensions is because, we got to find some way to distinguish among us. It's a little bit like, how shepherds could start to recognize their sheep. Once you're really in the whatever, you have a ton of data, then you get the tyranny of tiny differences, right? So that's what we're really seeing that would be my guess of personality, but I would bet the farm on that view. That's sort of my uninformed view of personality.
Because if I take a completely evolutionary view, for example, as someone who is very high in disagreeableness, especially for a woman, I feel reading all this stuff about the benefits of false beliefs, of being popular among your group, of agreeing with people on things that are important to them. This is a personality trait that gets me in trouble all the time. So there's something beyond just kind of optimization of modules. There's kind of modules that are misaligned or kind of in different balances for different people.
Yeah. Yeah, you want there to be a real there. You want there to be some factory setting for all of us. There's 5 dials and that's a real thing. I get that. So I'll give you one version of the response to this, which I don't stand by. So one thing of personality is that it's pretty heritable, right? So 0.3, 0.6 for each one of those things. And the usual story that people like me tell about heritability is that, look, if it were really important, evolution would have gotten rid of all that heritable variation, right? And so what you're really looking at, if you got heritable variation, it's not that important. Now, Jeffrey Miller would come back and say, no, there's this black rain of mutation and it's putting all that variation back in there. It happens all the time. And he's not wrong about that. So we could, look, we're not going to arbitrate this issue. I hear what you're saying. I mean, there's other sort of stories I could tell, which is that, we live in complicated social ecologies and evolution has to just roll the dice. It's got 5 dice. Rolls a number for each one, and then if it might get a hit with its good spot, and so maybe that's again, this is now I'm really beyond my expertise. I try to yeah.
Is there anything that you hoped I would ask you that I haven't asked you, or any topic that you would like us to have covered that we haven't touched upon?
That's a great question. I always appreciate it. No, I would say this has been, for me, this was great. I really am impressed with the depth at which you read the book. I'm flattered, actually, that you read it so carefully. I'm very grateful.
I really enjoyed it.
That's very nice. I appreciate that. I know you read a lot of books. And you put me in some good company when you tweeted about it. So I was very grateful for that as well. No, I think the only piece I sometimes get this question. The only piece I would add is that, to the extent there's any insights in there, which I don't know if there are, but it's all driven by the adaptationist approach to psychology. And I think it's just the only thing I would highlight is that, maybe modularity is not right, and maybe whatever the details of hypocrisy aren't right, but I do want to sort of publicize the approach to psychology. I think it's a very productive hypothesis generating engine. It's a good way to sort of avoid some. The self-esteem case is a good example where the effort case is a good example where you can sort of not immediately, but pretty quickly eliminate a lot of possibilities about what the psychology is going to be designed to look like by using this approach. That's the only thing I like to add is stepping back and saying, to the extent there's any insights here, it's driven by the fundamental marriage of Darwinism with cognitive science. And that marriage, I think, is going to continue to be fruitful. Again, in the context of that conversation I had with my mentor, I was completely wrong. I mean, Lita once used the term luminously wrong to describe how wrong I was about something. I was luminously wrong about this. If you'd asked me when I was in grad school, I thought these ideas were going to catch on. And by the time, 10 years had passed, everyone would be an evolutionary psychologist to the point you don't even use the word anymore. Well, of course, everyone knows, oh, we're evolved. Yeah, we should use that approach. This is a good hypothesis generation. That turned out just not to be right. And so the only thing I would say is that I think the power of this approach is still just to a large extent underappreciated. And I look forward to, additional more people using it to see what insights we can squeeze from it.
Yeah, I'm a massive fan, and I think a lot of people are quite afraid of evolutionary psychology because it's about us, and their fear is that it might offer some very strong arguments in favor of things about us that we don't want to be, that we don't want to find out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And that's a challenge. I mean, we just, the world is the world. And if we don't face it, then we're not going to be able to solve a problem. It's the same thing, right? This is a problem where this is more like Frogger than it is like crossing the street. Ignorance isn't going to help us. The biggest problems that face humanity, in my opinion, are really political problems. How do we organize ourselves? How do we work together? How do we cooperate in large polities? And to understand the answer to that, which is a political science question, ultimately requires good understanding of human nature, political science is going to be built on psychology. I don't see any way around it. And again, as you were saying, it's not, it's Frogger. We need to understand the machine if we're going to let the machines interact with each other and have rules that coordinate their activities in a productive, positive way. At least that's my view.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rob. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Absolutely.